Big ideas in small bites. This is Bite Sized, brought to you by Accenture.
Hello everyone and welcome to Bite Sized. Every year at Accenture we publish our technology vision, a view of the top trends that we believe will impact business over the coming years. This episode, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into our 2025 tech vision, which explores a world where AI is diffused across every dimension of our lives, where AI systems are speaking on behalf of brands, collaborating with workers, and operating within robotic bodies. This new level of autonomy can be the catalyst for limitless growth and innovation, but it is also disrupting the relationship between businesses, their customers, and their employees. It's introducing a new dimension to the trust equation. How much confidence do we have in our enterprise AI systems? How comfortable are we interacting with robots that can reason? And how much do employees trust businesses and governments to get the balance right? The speed with which we enter this new era and the value we can derive from AI will be underpinned by the trust that we have. So is trust the limit to AI's limitless possibilities? I'm delighted today to be joined by Simon Cooper, a senior IT executive with vast experience in large-scale IT organisational management and IT strategy in investment banking. Simon's here today to help me unpack these trends and explore whether AI really does have limitless possibilities. So to start with, I'd really love to know, what are your reflections on the vision? What really stands out for you?
First off, from an importance perspective, the digital core, I think that's absolutely critical to create a framework in which you can start to deploy your AI capabilities. And a subset of that would be the data. So I would call that the digital data core, which you have to get absolutely right, frankly, in order to underpin the trust that everybody's got in these AI capabilities. And then from a fascination perspective, this concept of agentic AIs and autonomous machines that are able to collaborate with each other to achieve outcomes that previously were very human intensive. I find that fascinating because I think that will revolutionize the way that the world works.
So on the one hand, I suppose there's the brilliant basics, the digital core, the data foundations. Yep. And then on the other hand, as you say, the vision talks about what feels like a very brave new world of humans truly interacting and collaborating every day with agents. I think it talks about us being on the precipice of this new era where that will mean that digital concepts can come to life in hours instead of days or weeks. And also it offers the promise of delivering a whole new level of personalisation. But clearly, when we think about those brilliant basics, we're not there yet. And so for organisations, it's more about leaning into what that future might look like rather than implementing it all immediately.
Yeah.
I suppose one of my reflections was, in many ways, obviously it's new and it's different, but at the same time, it feels like there are echoes with the dawn of cloud about a decade ago and the sort of tech transformation, the cloud transformation journey that we've been on over the last 10 years. I wondered if you see any parallels with that and if you think there are any lessons that businesses and organisations can take.
Absolutely. And if you look back, in recent history, each era seems to be about 20 years.
Right.
If you think about the launch of the internet and the dot-com era, let's call that late 90s, it's a very mature thing now, and it's just part of everybody's lives on a day-to-day basis. Cloud, let's say, came along in the, early 2010s, and so we're sort of midstream with the cloud era. But what I see from the cloud era is that because organizations weren't thoughtful about how they were going to implement cloud, they didn't have a nimble prototyping mentality, a lot of mistakes have been made because that foundation wasn't there. And in a lot of cases, cloud hasn't delivered the expected benefits for a lot of mature organizations. And so I think learning the lessons from that, be thoughtful. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Think about return on investment. There are a lot of basic things that I think you need to get right. Number one for mature organizations is, how do you fit this new technology, these new capabilities, alongside your existing very mature capabilities that are often built on legacy technology, where you want the two to operate in parallel for what is going to be a long period of time.
Right, so striking that balance between being a fast mover and innovating, but at the same time taking a very holistic view and thinking about what the long term is going to look like. And I suppose when we think about legacy technology, we had cloud native organizations start to emerge over the last 10 years. Now we're going to see the emergence of AI native organizations. And so actually there's a risk of compounding the legacy problem if you move too quickly.
I think that's exactly right. At the dawn of the cloud era, everybody was saying we're going to do this all ourselves, front to back.
Right.
Everything's going to move to cloud, and we're going to become, faster time to market, cheaper technology, and I think for organisations that are really sort of bounded in technology, like financial services organisations, that seems like a big problem to solve.
Right.
And so, I think you've got to prioritize. Think about the things that are going to add the most value to your organization. And then for the commodity things, look for partners rather than this idea of we're going to do everything ourselves.
I'd love to hear, Simon, what is it that you're seeing work well today with AI in the organizations that you see in the market?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would point to in the trends document is the little segments on portrait of the future. I think organizations need that art of the possible statement about where we might be able to get to, because it's going to be quite a long journey, a long road to get there. But if you've got that, this is what I think is the art of the possible, you can start to anchor everything you do against that. And, today, our capabilities are relatively rudimentary, and I'm sure in 3-5 years' time we'll look back and say, they weren't very good, really. And I would point to, before I get on to what's working well, you look at, the chatbots and the agents of today, they're not very good.
Compared to what they could be, I suppose,
and,
yes.
Compared to what they could be with the capabilities that are coming.
Let's come back into sort of where we are today with some of AI. Are there examples that you're seeing that are working particularly well?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment I'm working on some technology to streamline securities trade settlement in the financial services industry. It's an interesting business because there are so many actors involved in the settlement of an equity or a bond. You have the market maker, you've got the ultimate consumer, you've got an investment manager, you might have a custodian. So lots of different agents, all with their own view of what's going on. And as a consequence, many, many people involved in the settlement of that security. And yet, it's just a digital asset. That's all it is. It's a record of ownership of, debt in a company or equity in it. So as a consequence, you say, well, we should be able to have machines that settle this equity transaction, because the humans are just taking in information and deciding what to do about it. If there's a problem, okay, I need to go and talk to X. And guess what? The communication mechanism for all of that is email, which is a great way of agents communicating with each other because email is ubiquitous.
Yes.
And so, what we're focused on is saying, well, what is the process? So let's write that down for a start, and then look at each individual segment of the process and say, could we actually get a machine to do that? And so what we're actually doing is we're giving AI agents very, very specific responsibilities. It's a very sort of confined responsibility as a part of that securities trade settlement process. And I think that's a great place to start.
And what role do we all play in that kind of brave new world? Because I suppose if ultimately we can get to a point where the machines can settle the transaction, the machines can run our house purchase for us, how do you see that interplay, that kind of, the process evolving to bring together the expertise of the people together with the expertise of the machine?
I often hear, people say, they're very worried about AI because all of our jobs are going to go away. And you only have to look back in history to know that that's not the case, right? We'll all have different jobs.
Right, our jobs will evolve,
our
just
jobs
as
will
our
evolve.
relationship with the technology will evolve.
And, I can point to, my analogy is is farming.
Yes.
Only 50 years ago, you could go to a medium-sized farm and find 40 people working on it. You roll the clock forward to today, that same farm is run by 2 people and a load of machines.
I suppose, and equally, we have all of the lessons of history at our disposal, and so we need to learn from what has gone well and where some of the unforeseen consequences have been of some of those sort of transformations. I think where we're getting to now is what is at the heart of this year's vision, which is this concept of trust.
Yes.
How much do we trust AI agents, this new autonomous sort of world that is potentially where we could be going? In the vision, I think we identified that 75% of executives believe that only by building trust with their employees will they be able to fully capture the benefits of automation that can be enabled by AI. And I suppose one of my big takeaways from the vision is trust is something that's actually really hard to pin down. It's based on emotion as much as it's based on our logic and our reason. And so it's something that's very difficult to both measure and to earn. And so how do you think business leaders should be thinking about building that trust with their people, bearing in mind that there is this skepticism and perhaps discomfort about what AI could mean for all of us, and is it here to replace us?
Yeah, and I think also you've got to look at trust from 2 perspectives. Trust from the consumer's perspective, the customer's perspective, which is, am I happy to give my data to an agent? And then the second is the trust of the employee as the business evolves and it becomes a more digital business with, traditional jobs no longer existing. And I think in the latter case, we've seen this before, right? This isn't a new phenomenon. In my time working in the financial services sector, jobs that existed in the late 80s and early 90s, they don't exist anymore. They've gone. And yet lots of people that I work with back then are still working in the industry. They're just doing something else. And the same is true if you look at the communications industry. People that were laying physical cables and putting in physical exchanges and physical phone desktops, right? None of that exists anymore. It's an entirely digital business. And there's no plugging of wires. It's all done.
And people's roles have evolved
and yet
in line with that.
People's roles have evolved with it. So I think the answer for leaders is to say, A, good people will never lose their jobs because we are a business that's growing and evolving, and therefore we will need people to take us on that journey. And the good businesses are those that have far fewer people working on BAU because it's highly automated, and they're moving those people to change the organisation initiatives that are taking the business
transformation
forward.
of the business and how it interacts with customers and people. I suppose the thing I would add is that need that I see becoming more urgent to be really proactive around talent and skills, and thinking very proactively about how are our roles going to change? How are they going to evolve? And how do we get on the front foot for that to make sure that our people are ready for the ways in which their jobs will evolve and they are equipped with the right skills so that everyone can benefit the way that you've talked about, rather than a situation where people get left behind.
Skills you need as a run the organisation person versus a change the org, they're different. So you need to start reskilling people to be change agents, reskilling people to learn how to build AI models.
Yes.
And again, we've seen this before, where you had communications engineers who were physical folk who laid wires and plugged things in, who suddenly became digital network engineers who were able to build software-defined networks.
Yes.
So why can't that become the norm, which is people transitioning from BAU work to change the organisation work?
I really like the way you've encapsulated that, because I think that is the shift of many roles, which is from the day-to-day run and execution to something that is much more about driving change in whatever realm it might be. And I think that's actually a really positive and very helpful way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it, it's, what are you really doing? You're driving productivity for the organisation. Productivity means better return on investment, better returns to shareholders, ultimately that's how economies grow, and suddenly you've got the virtuous circle that everybody's looking for.
Exactly. And so let's then just hone in for my penultimate question to you, Simon, on this piece around investment, because for business leaders today, and if they read our tech vision, there's a huge amount there to grapple with. There are a lot of big questions for business leaders as to how they move forward to really lean into this future in a way that's going to create that virtuous circle of value. What would your key tips be for business leaders today to get the best return from investment, I suppose, in the near term, as well as thinking about the future?
So I think as we're entering this new era, I think organizations need to focus on, number one, the foundations. What's that digital core that I need to have in place so I know I'm going to be successful? And then the second is, don't take a scattergun approach. Let's be very focused about where we're going to take our early steps in deployment of AI capabilities, where we know that the return on investment is going to be greater. And maybe you don't focus on back office roles that return on investment may not be that great.
Right.
The place to focus is where I can increase, revenue or, product sales by 30 or 40% by creating agents that can spread the net a lot wider. So I think it's important to focus on foundations and don't scattergun, be very focused on where you start to do it.
Yes. I heard 3 S's there, Simon. I heard strong foundations, strategic focus to drive scale and scaled value.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is absolutely right. And particularly the piece around the strong foundations, because if you build the strong foundations now, then there's obviously no limit to what you can then evolve in the future. But the gaps today will create much greater legacy problems as you go
and
forward.
Also learning a lesson from the vision, the trends document is, have your North Star vision.
Yes.
Write down what the portrait of the future could be for your organization, because I think that will then be very helpful in starting to prioritize where you focus your effort now.
I want to just ask you a question that we ask all of our guests on Bite Size, which is, apart from Accenture's technology vision, what is it that you're reading to or listening to at the moment that's really giving you pause for thought or inspiration?
So I'm going to pick 2 books.
Brilliant.
If you don't mind. The first is a book called Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. I don't know whether you've read it.
I am a geography graduate, and so this is one of my favourites.
And I think what's fascinating about that book is Tim's analysis of geopolitical history to predict the future.
Yes.
And I think he wrote the book in 2014, something like that. And he accurately predicted the Ukrainian war and the conflict in the Middle East, which is not necessarily a good thing. But what I take from that is, okay, if we can use history to predict the future, maybe that we can then use that information to try and avoid the conflicts that are maybe being predicted. And then the second book, which is more of a call to arms book, is a book called But What Can I Do?, which is written by Alistair Campbell. And it's about the fact that everybody should have a deep interest in politics and should be driving their political representatives, because it's the politicians that are going to set the framework, the rules, the legislation in which we all operate, as we know. And again, as we come into the AI era, I think it's incumbent upon us, the people, to make sure that our politicians are thinking about this sort of stuff, because I think legislation and setting of rules is going to be vital to make sure that we steer AI capabilities in the right direction and not the wrong direction.
It's our collective future, and we all have a role to play in shaping it. Thank you, Simon. I am adding that one to my reading list, as I'm sure many of our listeners will be as well. But I think it's a brilliant way to close what has been an absolutely fascinating discussion with you about AI and the future and what it means for all of us. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our listeners. This has been Bite Sized.